I just think that ultimately we have a constitutional responsibility in the Senate to process these articles. And I think in order to right the moral ship of this nation, you can't skip the accountability phase for the president who tried over and over and over again over the final days of his presidency to try to lead either a nonviolent or a violent insurrection against democracy.
Hello and welcome to the GZERO World Podcast. Here you'll find extended versions of the interviews from my show on public television. I'm Ian Bremmer, and this week we're doing something a bit different. I'll bring you two in-depth conversations with members of Congress from different sides of the aisle in two separate episodes of the podcast. First up, Democratic Senator Chris Murphy on the January 6th Capitol attacks, why impeachment is necessary, and what President Biden can realistically get accomplished in his first 100 days. Let's get to it.
The GZERO World Podcast is brought to you by our founding sponsor, First Republic. First Republic, a private bank and wealth management company, places clients' needs first by providing responsive, relevant, and customized solutions. Visit firstrepublic.com to learn more.
Senator Chris Murphy, so glad you're joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So let me start off back on December 11th, 2020, which seems like eons ago. You actually said, I want to quote on the Senate floor, "The most serious attempt to overthrow our democracy in the history of our country is underway." What made you so sure so early that this was more than just typical Trump theatrics?
You know, that speech felt out of place to a lot of people when I gave it. Nobody was really raising the potential for insurrection in early December. What caused me to give that speech was the fact that so many House Republicans had signed on to this ludicrous brief alleging that there was substantial fraud in the election such that Donald Trump should be named president for the next 4 years. To me, it was the sort of first act of sort of mass rebellion from institutional Republicans in Washington. And it signaled that there was, going to be a mainstreaming of this idea that Joe Biden was an illegitimate president inside the Republican Party. That's exactly what continued to happen over the course of the next month, leading to the events of January 6th. But as I mentioned that in that speech, my concern was, frankly, much more long-term beyond just what was going to happen between then and inauguration. This idea that anytime a Democrat wins an election, it must be illegitimate. It must be because of fraud, even if you can't find any evidence of fraud. That is the beginning of the end for democracy, because at some point, some Republican election official will be successful in overturning the election of a Democratic mayor or a Democratic governor or a Democratic senator. And then, the rest of us have to decide whether we're still all in this together if we actually can't rely on elections to be how we determine who leads this country.
Did you have friends or at least colleagues across the aisle that were telling you privately, look, we got to go along with this, but it's just theater. You know what the president's like. And, in a couple of months, this is all over.
Sure. The minute that letter came out with 12 Senate Republicans suggesting they were going to vote against the certification of the Electoral College, I got on the phone. I was that weekend talking to one of those senators who told me a version of the story, you just laid out, that, that their constituents were so upset about the election, were so convinced that there was fraud, that this senator felt like he had an obligation to give voice to those concerns by joining up with Senator Hawley and Senator Cruz's efforts, even though he didn't really believe the election was rigged. He just thought that it was his responsibility to align himself with this point of view because so many people in his state thought that. That's a little bit of the argument that Hawley is making today. It's such a dangerous argument because it then incentivizes people like Donald Trump to spin up conspiracy theories, because then it binds or obligates members of the president's party to then carry forward that argument.
So on the day of the 6th, you were actually in a safe room for some 6 hours with a number of your colleagues. Did we at least have unity for those 6 hours? What surprised you about your conversations during that time?
Well, I guess what surprised me most was our inability to become unified. I mean, at that point, Senator Hawley had a decision to make. He could stand down and not offer additional objections to the certification of the electoral vote. He could have taken steps to recognize how dangerous his actions were and how they had led in part to the siege of the Capitol, but that's not what occurred. Well, about 6 or 7 Republicans did change their minds and vote against Senator Hawley and Senator Cruz's motions. Senator Hawley still went ahead with it, and 100 plus House members voted for his resolution, I would argue further inflaming the crisis at a moment when we should have been all coming together.
I mean, I almost hate to ask you this question, or at least put it this way, but given that, and given now the growing chorus from Republicans that, look, I mean, come on, impeachment, you're just slowing everything down, let bygones be bygones. Was this crisis not big enough?
Well, I mean, I think it's really wild to think what could have happened that day. I mean, let's take these rioters at their word. They were chanting, "Hang Mike Pence." They were walking around with stun guns and zip ties. I mean, had they run into members of Congress, had they found Mike Pence, some really terrible things beyond what already happened could have happened. Maybe that crisis would have been big enough, but just because the absolute worst didn't happen, just because only 5 people died, not 500, that doesn't mean that what happened deserves consequence. Because if you don't hold people responsible, then the rule of law falls apart in this country. So, maybe Republicans are looking at this and thinking that, in retrospect, it wasn't that bad. It was bad, and it could have been much worse.
The impeachment trial in the Senate is about to start in the coming week. Does it feel a little like status quo ante is slipping back to you?
I do think there were a lot of Republicans who, had used their vote on impeachment as a mechanism to try to keep Donald Trump in line. And to the extent he has been relatively quiet since the 6th, it may mean that some Republicans are going to end up voting to acquit the president. I think that's a mistake. But I do think that in the end, there may not be a whole lot of Republican votes. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't go through with the exercise. I just think that, ultimately, we have a constitutional responsibility in the Senate to process these articles. And I think in order to sort of right the moral ship of this nation, you can't skip the accountability phase for the president who tried over and over and over again over the final days of his presidency to try to lead either a nonviolent or a violent insurrection against democracy.
But will an acquittal, if it happens, basically show that impeachment is no longer a tool that the legislative branch of the country actually has, and that balance of power in the United States has, in a fundamental way, actually eroded?
Well, the irony of all of this is that, in the end, I don't think that impeachment is rendered impotent as a tool, but maybe only when a Republican is president. I mean, maybe I'm being Pollyannish and naive about this, but I do think that Democrats would act differently if a president of our party had engaged in these abuses. And so maybe that's not a fair outcome, that a Democratic president could be impeached, but a Republican president cannot be impeached. But I think it's important for us to act consistently and to make clear in the future that we'll hold leaders of our parties to the same standard. That, I think, means that impeachment is not essentially rendered irrelevant.
So let me ask you about some of the policies that we're facing right now. I mean, the most important, overwhelmingly, with President Biden in place is $1.9 trillion on the docket. Biden talking about unity, the Republicans saying that the Democrats aren't interested in unity. Where do you think this stimulus bill ends up going?
It's going to pass because it is a bill that unifies the country. right? What Biden has put on the table are broadly popular policy measures, more money for increased vaccine production and distribution, $2,000 in the pockets of ordinary low-income and middle-income Americans, money to make sure that all of our schools, K through 8, open in the next 100 days. All of that is wildly popular. And so when the president talks about a unifying agenda, he has presented it to the American public. It's not my fault or the president's fault that Republicans are thinking about voting against a very popular agenda to try to rescue the country from this pandemic. And so in that way, I think even if a bunch of Republicans vote no, it's still a unifying agenda. The president, can't literally force Republicans to vote for something, but what he can do is put on the table ideas that are supported by 60, 70, 80% of the American public.
But does that likely end up being more like a party line vote? Do you think that's what legislation is just generally going to look like in 2021?
Listen, I was here in 2009, and Mitch McConnell made very clear at that moment that his number one priority was beating Barack Obama, not helping to solve the economic crisis. I worry that Republicans are going to take the same position here. And we're going to spend a lot of time in the next couple of weeks trying to find common ground with Republicans. Ultimately, we're going to have to be willing to take no for an answer. If their priority is obstructionism, if their priority is opposition, no matter the popularity of the legislation, we're ultimately going to have to move the bill because people are hurting out there. The vaccine's not getting into people's arms quickly enough. Schools are having trouble keeping the doors open. We just, we have to solve problems, and we can't ultimately let Republican obstructionism stop us from doing that.
How about nothing? Would nothing work for you? It's always one of my favorite movies as a negotiating platform. So let me ask you on the filibuster. You've used the filibuster most famously 5 years ago after the Pulse nightclub mass shooting, 15-hour filibuster to force debate of gun control on the floor. Do you think that it is feasible, and would you support removing the filibuster going forward?
I have long been a proponent of reform of the filibuster. I use the rules that are at my disposal, as I did in 2016. But of course, there are sort of two different things that are called a filibuster. Long speeches to try to force action are called filibusters, but then also this rule in which you have to get 60 votes to pass anything is also called the filibuster. So as much as in 2016, I used the filibuster to my advantage, I also was defeated by the filibuster because the measures I was proposing had 50 vote support, but didn't have 60 vote support in the end. So I would certainly support reforming it, allowing for more measures to be passed by 50 vote majorities rather than 60 vote majorities. Maybe that's a first step before we eliminate it entirely. That's frankly consistent with what Republicans did when they were in charge. They didn't eliminate the filibuster. They just sort of changed the kind of things that you could filibuster. So for instance, they said, hey, Supreme Court justices can no longer be filibustered. Well, maybe we'll look at a narrow set of things that 50 votes is good enough for, in the same way that Republicans made that change when they were in charge.
So let's close with the speed round on my favorite topic, foreign policy, especially since you're on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Maybe start all of the things that Trump has done for good or bad. What are the couple that you'd like to make sure the Biden administration does not throw out the window where you think there's been success?
Well, it's a very narrow list, but for me, at the top of it probably is the path that we're on in Afghanistan right now. Listen, I think Trump's negotiation was ham-handed and done poorly, but his idea is not wrong, that we do need to sort of put a definitive time stamp on our engagement there, and we need to be in discussions with both the Taliban and the Afghan government to figure out a way for us to leave. Second, to the extent that some of his bullying techniques succeeded in making European countries more willing to spend additional dollars on their own defense, we should do it differently, but we should make it clear to the Europeans that we need them to be sort of more fulsome participants in the defense of Europe. So those would be two areas in which I think that we can maintain some continuity.
Now, Iran is going to be a big area where you're not going to see continuity. And the foreign minister of Iran is saying, let's get back to the JCPOA, the Obama-Iranian nuclear deal, as soon as possible. The Biden administration seems to be a little tentative on that front. Where do you think they should go?
They should get back into the deal. They should offer compliance for compliance. And I think we should all, be very strong in the way that we push back on the Iran hawks claims, right? They said we shouldn't have gone into the JCPOA because instead we should have continued to ratchet up sanctions on Iran, even if that had to be in a unilateral basis, until Iran was willing to put all of our outstanding issues on the table, not just the nuclear issue, but also their support for terrorist groups, their ballistic missile program. Well, the Trump administration tried that approach for the last 4 years. They ratcheted up sanctions through their maximum pressure campaign. As predicted, the Europeans didn't go along. They told the Iranians, we're not willing to talk until you put everything on the table. And they failed. It failed miserably. The Iranians weren't willing to talk about anything. In fact, they restarted their nuclear research program. The Europeans abandoned us and undermined our sanctions. So we've had the chance to test the other way to do this. The better solution is to get back into compliance with the JCPOA, get Iran back into compliance, and then use this coalition, the United States, Europe, China, and Russia, in order to put pressure on them on other fronts like their ballistic missile program.
Final big foreign policy question for you is on China. This is obviously the Chinese are already showing signs of testing the Americans in terms of military incursions around Taiwan. The technology relationship is poor. The trade relationship is fraught. There's really no trust between the world's two largest economies right now. If you were to tell Biden to do it any differently than Trump has, what would your suggestions be?
My primary suggestion would be to think about our relationship with China through the prism of capacities. Right now, we cannot fight China toe-to-toe because China can do things in the world that we can't. For instance, their International Development Bank is 3 times as large as ours is. Their ability to midwife technologies domestically and then spring them on the world cannot be met by the United States because we lack an industrial policy that puts us in the position of being able to compete with them on something like 5G. Their propaganda arm is much better funded and much more powerful than our anti-propaganda arm. So I think before we sit down at the table with the Chinese to try to figure out what the new world order is and how we manage their rise, we've just got to build up our capacities, our industrial policy capacities, our anti-propaganda capacities, our international development financing capacities, so that we can actually meet them on an even playing field. That's what I think the most important first step for the administration is.
Senator Chris Murphy, thanks for being with me.
Thanks, Ian.
So that was my conversation with Democratic Senator Chris Murphy. Stay tuned for a bonus episode dropping into your feed shortly with freshman Republican Congresswoman Nancy Mace. I asked her some of the same questions I posed to Senator Murphy, and her responses were surprisingly similar to Murphy's in a few key ways. Don't miss it. And if you like what you've heard, find out more at GZEROmedia.com.
The GZERO World podcast is brought to you by our founding sponsor, First Republic. First Republic, a private bank and wealth management company, places clients' needs first by providing responsive, relevant, and customized solutions. Visit firstrepublic.com to learn more.
You're listening to the GZERO World with Ian Bremmer podcast, your weekly geopolitical deep dive into the world's biggest news stories, featuring in-depth conversations with global leaders and newsmakers. To get more of GZERO's insights on global politics every morning, sign up for our free newsletter, GZERO Daily, at GZEROmedia.com.